Emily and I had been together for over 10 years, our marriage built on a foundation that, for the most part, felt solid. We had 2 kids, Jake, who had just started 2nd grade, and Lily, our spirited kindergartner. They were at that age where mornings were chaos, evenings were noisy, and weekends were filled with soccer games, birthday parties, and playdates. Life was a careful balancing act between work, family, and the occasional stolen moment of quiet. I worked in logistics, spending most of my days coordinating deliveries and schedules, while Emily had a demanding role as an executive assistant for one of the city's more prominent real estate firms. Her job often came with unpredictable hours, but she handled it with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything in her life. We lived in a modest but comfortable suburban home, the kind with a swing set in the backyard and school artwork taped to the fridge. On most days, we were like any other family, packing lunches, chasing after missing shoes, and collapsing on the couch after the kids were finally in bed. That week, though, our usual rhythm was broken by the excitement of an upcoming celebration. Emily's boss, Paul, had announced that the company was throwing a grand party to mark a major milestone, a decade of success. The event was set to be a glamorous evening at one of the city's most upscale restaurants, with employees, spouses, and some notable clients invited. Emily seemed particularly invested in the party. She spent a lot of time sorting through her wardrobe, finally settling on an elegant navy dress she'd picked up months ago but hadn't yet had the chance to wear. She even insisted that I dust off my suit, which rarely saw the light of day. The kids, of course, wouldn't be joining us. My sister, a godsend in moments like these, offered to watch them overnight, ensuring we could fully enjoy the evening without worrying about bedtime tantrums or spilled juice. As the day of the party approached, Emily's excitement was infectious. She spoke of the event often, detailing the guest list and recounting amusing anecdotes about her colleagues. Even I found myself looking forward to it, a rare chance for the 2 of us to enjoy a night out, dressed up and surrounded by people. I didn't know it yet, but the night of the party would mark a turning point, a moment that would alter the course of everything I thought I understood about my life. The day of the party arrived, bustling with the usual morning chaos. Jake forgot his science project at home, and Lily decided her socks didn't match the energy of her outfit. Her words, not mine. Amidst the whirlwind of getting everyone out the door, Emily seemed unusually composed. She hummed while making breakfast, her mood brighter than I'd seen it in weeks. By the time evening rolled around, the house was quiet. The kids were with my sister, and the absence of their chatter left the house feeling almost unfamiliar. Emily emerged from the bedroom, wearing the navy dress she'd chosen. It fit her perfectly, exuding elegance without trying too hard. I complimented her, and she smiled warmly. We arrived at the restaurant just as the party was beginning. The venue was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline, a live jazz band playing softly in the corner, and waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne. It felt worlds away from our usual routine of takeout dinners and soccer games. Emily quickly became the life of the party, moving through the crowd with an ease that left me in her wake. She introduced me to her colleagues, including Paul, her boss, a tall, charismatic man who seemed to have a story for every person he greeted. He was gracious, complimenting Emily on her work ethic and ability to handle challenges with poise. As the night progressed, I found myself with a drink in hand, seated at a table with a few other spouses, exchanging small talk while Emily mingled. She floated from one conversation to another, her laughter ringing out above the hum of the room. At one point, I noticed she'd been gone for a while. The last I saw, she had been speaking with Paul near the bar. I told myself it wasn't unusual. After all, she knew most of the people here, and this was her work environment. I stepped outside onto the balcony for some air, the cool night breeze a welcome contrast to the warmth inside. That's when one of Emily's colleagues, a woman I vaguely recognized from earlier introductions, joined me. She looked like she had something on her mind, her expression hesitant but determined. "I probably shouldn't be saying this," she began, her voice low, "but I think you deserve to know. Something's not right." I forced a casual tone, though my heart raced. "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if worried someone might overhear. "I've seen them together, Emily and Paul. It's not just professional. Tonight especially, they've been close. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't process them. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to office gossip or a misunderstanding. But something about her tone, her expression, told me she wasn't exaggerating. She pointed subtly toward a side corridor leading away from the main room. I saw them head that way a little while ago. I don't want to assume the worst, but maybe you should check. I stood there for a moment, frozen between disbelief and a growing sense of dread. The noise from the party seemed distant, muffled by the pounding in my ears. I thanked her, my voice barely audible, and made my way toward the corridor. The soft hum of the party fading with every step I took. As I walked, I told myself I'd find nothing, that this was a misunderstanding, an innocent moment blown out of proportion. The faint sound of voices reached my ears as I moved closer. They were low, hushed tones that blended into the quiet. A part of me hesitated, questioning whether I should turn back. But something stronger, curiosity, suspicion, or maybe just a desperate need for clarity, propelled me forward. At the end of the hall, I spotted a partially open door. It was one of those smaller private rooms, likely meant for quiet conversations or business discussions during events. I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. My breath caught as I peeked through the crack in the door. Inside, Emily was sitting on the edge of a plush sofa, her face inches away from Paul's. He leaned in, his hand resting lightly on her knee, his voice too low for me to catch the words. But their body language told me enough. It wasn't the casual camaraderie of colleagues or even friends. My mind raced to find explanations, excuses, anything that might make this seem less damning. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that this was more than just an innocent conversation. Paul's hand moved slightly, a gesture that seemed both casual and deliberate, and Emily didn't pull away. The weight of what I was witnessing pressing down on me like a lead blanket. My hands balled into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. How dare he? Without thinking, I pushed the door open with enough force that it slammed against the wall. The sound startled them both. Emily jumped to her feet, her eyes wide, her face draining of color. Paul's smirk faltered, his cool demeanor cracking under my glare. Paul didn't even bother to stand. He leaned back in that infuriatingly smug way of his, like he was trying to brush this off, trying to maintain his calm. He started to say something meaningless, something I didn't want to hear. I cut him off sharply, my voice rising, no longer caring who might hear me. The sheer audacity of him, the arrogance to think he could act like this was nothing. I took a step closer, looming over him, feeling every ounce of anger I'd been trying to suppress boil to the surface. Emily reached out toward me then, her hand shaky as it touched my arm. She tried to explain, but the words she chose only added fuel to the fire. The excuses, the attempts to make me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. It was too much. I pulled away from her grasp, the sharpness in my words cutting through the air between us. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't affect me this time. Not after this. She stumbled through fragmented words, trying to make sense of her own betrayal, trying to soften the blow, but it all rang hollow. Paul finally stood, his hands raised in some pathetic gesture, as if he thought he could play the peacemaker now. The sheer nerve of him, it was unbearable. Before he could say anything more, I moved, my body acting faster than my thoughts. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him staggering back. The sight of him clutching his face, groaning, was oddly satisfying. For a brief second, I wanted to keep going, to make him feel even a sliver of the pain that had been coursing through me. But I stopped. I wasn't going to waste more on him than he deserved. I stood over him, my voice cold and filled with everything I felt in that moment. He didn't deserve to say another word. Not to me. Not to anyone. Emily was crying now, her hands covering her face, her words a mess of apologies that didn't mean a thing anymore. She kept saying how sorry she was, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear her talk about how she hadn't thought about me, about what we'd built together, about the family we were supposed to be. There was nothing left to say. I turned and left, not just the room but the entire building. The noise of the party, the faces of the guests, the bright lights, it all blurred together as I walked away. The anger in my chest burned hotter with every step, but beneath it, there was something worse, something heavier. The weight of everything that had just shattered. When I got home, it felt like a stranger's house. The walls, the pictures, the memories, they all felt false now, like they belonged to someone else, someone who didn't know what I now knew. I sat on the edge of the bed, the wedding ring on my finger suddenly heavy, unbearably so. It no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a burden. Hours later, Emily came home. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she tried to talk to me, to explain, to apologize. I didn't even look at her. When I finally spoke, the words were calm but final. There was no room for debate, no space for forgiveness. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with it. She cried, louder this time, her sobs filling the room. But they didn't move me. Not this time. I got up and left the room, the sound of her grief fading behind me. The life we'd built, the future we'd planned, it was gone. Shattered into pieces I had no interest in picking up. But one thing I knew for certain, I wouldn't let her, or him, break me. Not anymore. The next few days felt like a blur. Each morning I woke up to a house that didn't feel like mine anymore, to a silence that used to bring comfort but now only felt suffocating. Emily was still there, moving around quietly as though she didn't want to disturb the tenuous thread holding our lives together. She tried to speak to me a few times, her voice soft and pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. What was there to say? Her apologies didn't change what had happened, and every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal, etched in my mind like a scar. I started leaving the house early, finding excuses to stay out longer than I needed to. Work, errands, even sitting in the parking lot of a coffee shop just to avoid coming back to her. Each time I returned, the tension was palpable. Our kids, thankfully, were still blissfully unaware of what was going on. Their laughter echoed through the halls, a sharp contrast to the heaviness between Emily and me. I tried my best to keep things normal for them, to keep my anger and hurt buried deep when they were around. But it wasn't easy. Late one evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emily and I sat across from each other at the dining table. She looked completely drained, her face pale and her eyes swollen and red, as though tears had been her only companion for hours. The weight of the silence between us was almost suffocating until she finally spoke. She started hesitantly, her voice thin and trembling, saying she needed to talk and that she knew the pain she had caused me. The words barely left her lips before I cut her off, unable to keep my emotions in check. It wasn't just pain she had caused. It was the destruction of everything I thought we had built together. The foundation of our relationship, everything I had believed in, had crumbled before my eyes. Her hands clung to the edge of the table, as if holding on for support. She tried to explain, her voice fragile as she began to mention him, but I stopped her before she could even finish. My patience had worn too thin to listen to her shift responsibility. Whatever had happened, I reminded her, was the result of choices she made. Shifting blame wasn't going to make anything better. Tears started flowing again, but I refused to react the way I once might have. The sight of her crying no longer stirred the same instinct to comfort her. I couldn't let it. Not anymore. She insisted she never wanted any of this, that hurting me had never been her intention. She spoke of love, for me, for our family, and said she regretted it all, that she wanted to make things right. But as I leaned back in my chair, studying her, her words felt hollow. They sounded like something she had repeated to herself so often that the meaning had faded, leaving only empty echoes of what she thought I needed to hear. After a long, heavy silence, I asked her how something like this could possibly be fixed. I wanted to know how the images in my mind could ever be erased, how trust could be restored when it felt like there was nothing left to build on. She had no answer. The silence between us only deepened, broken occasionally by her muffled sobs. Eventually, I pushed back my chair, the sound sharp in the otherwise still room. I told her I didn't know what the future held, or if there was even a way forward. What I did know, however, was that I couldn't continue living like this, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. The weight of it all was unbearable, and every time I saw her, the hurt resurfaced. I left the table and walked away, not looking back. The weight of that conversation followed me upstairs, settling heavily on my chest as I shut the bedroom door behind me. It was the only space I could retreat to, the only place that felt even slightly mine. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling. Her words played over and over in my mind, blending with memories of the life we had shared before all of this. But no matter how much I turned it over in my head, the answers I was searching for still felt impossibly out of reach. Emily kept her distance, and I found myself avoiding her as much as I could. We coexisted in the same house, but it felt like we were worlds apart. The laughter and warmth that once filled our home had been replaced by something cold and brittle, a fragile truce held together only for the sake of the kids. At work, I threw myself into tasks, desperate for something to take my mind off the chaos at home. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories and questions kept creeping in. I'd catch myself wondering when it had all started, when the little cracks in our relationship had begun to spread without me noticing. Evenings were the hardest. The quiet of the house after the kids went to bed felt suffocating. I'd sit in the living room, staring blankly at the TV or scrolling aimlessly through my phone, anything to distract myself. Emily would stay in the kitchen or retreat to the bedroom, each of us too afraid, or too exhausted, to face the other. One night, as I was tidying up after dinner, I found a note tucked between some papers on the counter. It was from Emily. Her handwriting was shaky, the lines uneven, as if she had written it in a hurry. Brandon, I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix what I've broken, but I want to try. If you're willing, I think we should talk. Not just about what happened, but about everything. Where we go from here, what we want. I'll be in the guest room tonight if you're ready to talk. Emily. I read the note 3 times, each word pulling at the tangled mess of emotions inside me. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, to reject the very idea of sitting down with her after everything. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the woman I had fallen in love with, hesitated. I spent the next hour pacing the house, torn between anger and a faint, lingering hope. Maybe she really wanted to make amends. Maybe this was just another way to justify her actions. I couldn't tell anymore. Eventually, I found myself standing outside the guest room door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. A million thoughts raced through my mind. What I would say, what she might say, whether there was even a point to trying anymore. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and stepped inside. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched on, heavy and loaded with everything we hadn't said to each other. Finally, I broke it, my voice low and even. "All right, Emily," I said, sitting down in the chair across from her. "Let's talk." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, taking a deep breath. What followed was one of the hardest conversations of my life. She started from the beginning, recounting how things had spiraled for her. She talked about feeling unappreciated, unseen, and how those feelings had led her down a path she hadn't meant to take. There were moments when her words stung like daggers, moments when I wanted to get up and leave, but I stayed. I owed it to myself, to us, to hear her out. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part pleading, part resigned. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said quietly, "but I want to try to rebuild, if you'll let me." I sat there for a long time, letting her words settle. The hurt was still raw, and forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb. But sitting there in that room, I realized that this was a turning point. Whether we stayed together or went our separate ways, this was the moment we had to face everything head-on. "I don't know what the future holds," I said finally, my voice steady but tired. "But I know that nothing will change unless we're both honest, with each other and ourselves." She nodded, tears streaming down her face again. And as I sat there, I felt a small glimmer of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Maybe not hope, but at least the possibility of it. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, something inside me shifted. The next morning, I decided to change the routine. Instead of retreating to the garage or drowning in work, I packed up the kids and took them to the park. It wasn't planned, and I wasn't sure how it would play out, but something about their laughter and carefree energy felt like the reset button I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt present. I wasn't consumed by images of betrayal or the weight of unanswered questions. I was just their dad, pushing them on swings and chasing them across the grass. When we got home, Emily was standing in the kitchen, surprised to see us all walk in together. There was a tension in the air, but I didn't let it settle. I asked her to join us for lunch, and though she hesitated, she agreed. It wasn't much, a meal at the dining table, the four of us together like we used to be. But in that moment, it felt significant. Not because everything was fixed, but because it reminded me of what was at stake. Over the following weeks, I started focusing less on dissecting every moment of betrayal and more on rebuilding something for myself. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd neglected, and began taking small steps to reclaim parts of my life that had been overshadowed by everything else. Emily noticed, of course. She gave me space, but also made it clear that she was still there, still waiting. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I walked into the living room and found her sitting with a pile of old photo albums. She didn't say anything as I sat down beside her, but she slid one of the albums toward me. It was from the early years, the awkward honeymoon photos, snapshots of our first apartment, pictures from when the kids were babies. We flipped through the pages silently, each photo pulling at memories I thought I'd buried. As the night went on, I found myself sharing stories I hadn't thought about in years. Some made her laugh, others brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic reconciliation. It was simply two people, sitting together in the quiet of their home, remembering what they'd once been. And that's when it hit me, the turning point I didn't know I'd been waiting for. The decision wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about deciding whether the pieces left behind were worth picking up, whether I could look at her, at us, and see something worth salvaging. Not for the sake of appearances or the kids, but because, deep down, I still wanted to believe in the life we'd built. In the end, I didn't have a perfect answer or a clear resolution. Life doesn't work that way. But as I sat there, flipping through those worn pages and listening to the soft hum of Emily's voice, I realized something. The choice to move forward isn't made in a single moment. It's made every day, in the little decisions to stay, to try, and to hope. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to make that choice.